clear that he was selling common stock and not snake oil, Saunders repeated his offer to sell at $55 a share and went on to explain that he was being so generous because, as a far-sighted businessman, he was anxious to have Piggly Wiggly owned by itself, customers and other small investors rather than by Wall Street sharks. To many people, though, it appeared that Saunders was being generous to the point of folly. The price of Piggly Wiggly on the New York Stock Exchange was just then pushing 70. It looked as if Saunders were handing anyone who had $55 in his pocket a chance to make $15 with no risk. The arrival of a new Daniel, Joseph, or Moses might be debatable, but opportunity certainly did seem to be knocking. All right, actually, as the skeptical must have suspected, there was a catch. In making what sounded like such a costly and unbusinesslike offer, Saunders, a rank novice at corner, had devised one of the craftiest dodges ever used in the game. One of the great hazards in corner was always that even though a player might defeat his opponents, he would discover that he had won a Pyrrhic victory once the short sellers had been squeezed dry. That is, the cornerer might find that the reams of stock he had accumulated in the process were a dead weight around his neck. By pushing it all back into the market in one shove, he would drive its price down close to zero. And if, like Saunders, he had to borrow heavily to get into the game in the first place, his creditors could be expected to close in on him and perhaps not only divest him of his gains, but drive him into bankruptcy. Saunders apparently anticipated this hazard almost as soon as a corner was in sight, and accordingly made plans to unload some of his stock before winning instead of afterward. His problem was to keep the stock he sold from going right back into the floating supply, thus breaking his corner, and his solution was to sell his $55 shares on the installment plan. In his February advertisements, he stipulated that the public could buy shares only by paying $25 down and the balance in three $10 installments, due June 1st, September 1st, and December 1st, and December 1st. In addition, and vastly more important, he said he would not turn over the stock certificates to the buyers until the final installment had been paid. Since the buyers obviously couldn't sell the certificates until they had them, the stock could not be used to replenish the floating supply. Thus, Saunders had until December 1st to squeeze the short sellers dry. Easy as it may be to see through Saunders' plan by hindsight, his maneuver was then so unorthodox that for a while neither the governors of the stock exchange nor Livermore himself could be quite sure what the man in Memphis was up to. The stock exchange began making formal inquiries, and Livermore began getting skittish. But he went on buying for Saunders' account and succeeded in pushing Piggly Wiggly's price up well above 70. In Memphis, Saunders sat back comfortably. He temporarily ceased singing the praises of Piggly Wiggly stock in his ads and devoted them to eulogizing apples, grapefruit, onions, hams, and Lady Baltimore cakes. Early in March, though, he ran another financial ad, repeating his stock offer and inviting any readers who wanted to discuss it with him to drop in at his Memphis office. He also emphasized that quick action was necessary. Time was running out. By now, it was apparent that Saunders was trying for a corner, and on Wall Street was not only the Piggly Wiggly bears who were becoming apprehensive. Finally, Livermore, possibly reflecting that in 1908 he had lost almost $1 million trying to get a corner in cotton, could stand it no longer. He demanded that Saunders come to New York and talk things over. Saunders arrived on the morning of March 12th. As he later described the meeting to reporters, there was a difference of opinion. Livermore, he said, and his tone was that of a man rather set up over having made a piker out of the boy plunger, gave me the impression that he was a little afraid of my financial situation and that he did not care to be involved in any market crash. The upshot of the conference was that Livermore bowed out of the Piggly Wiggly operation, leaving Saunders to run it by himself. Saunders then boarded a train for Chicago to attend to some business there. At Albany, he was handed a telegram from a member of the stock exchange who was the nearest thing he had to a friend in the white charger and coat, mail set. The telegram informed him that his antics had provoked a great deal of head shaking in the councils of the exchange and urged him to stop creating a second market by advertising stock for sale at a price so far below the quotation on the exchange. At the next station, Saunders telegraphed back a rather unresponsive reply. If it was a possible corner the exchange was fretting about, he said, he could assure the governors that they could put their fears aside since he himself was maintaining the floating supply by daily offering stock for loan in any amount desired. But he didn't say how long he would continue to do so. A week later, on Monday, March 19, Saunders ran a newspaper ad stating that his stock offer was about to be withdrawn. This was the last call. At the time, or so he claimed afterward, he had acquired all but 1128 of Piggly Wiggly's 200,000 outstanding shares for a total of 198,872, some of which he owned and the rest of which he owned and the rest of which he controlled, a reference to the installment plan shares whose certificates he still held. Actually, this figure was open to considerable argument. There was one private investor in Providence, for instance, who alone held 1,100 shares. But there is no denying that Saunders had in his hands practically every single share of Piggly Wiggly then available for trading, and that he therefore had his corner. On that same Monday, it is believed, Saunders telephoned Livermore and asked if he would relent long enough to see the Piggly Wiggly project through by calling for delivery of all the shares that were owed Saunders. In other words, would Livermore please spring the trap? "Nothing doing," Livermore is supposed to have replied, evidently considering himself well out of the whole affair. So the following morning, Tuesday, March 20th, Saunders sprang the trap himself. It turned out to be one of Wall Street's wilder days. Piggly Wiggly opened at 75.5, up 5.5 from the previous day's closing price. An hour after the opening, word arrived that Saunders had called for delivery of all his Piggly Wiggly stock. According to the rules of the exchange, stock called for under such circumstances had to be produced by 2:15 the following afternoon. But Piggly Wiggly, as Saunders well knew, simply wasn't to be had, except of course from him. To be sure, there were a few shares around that were still held by private investors and frantic short sellers trying to shake them loose, bid their price up and up. But by and large, there wasn't much actual trading in Piggly Wiggly because there was so little Piggly Wiggly to be traded. The stock exchange post where it was bought and sold became the center of a mob scene as 2/3 of the brokers on the floor clustered around it. A few of them to bid, but most of them just to push, op, and otherwise get in on the excitement. Desperate short sellers bought Piggly Wiggly at 90, then at 100, then at 110. Reports of sensational profits made the rounds. The Providence investor, who had picked up his 1,100 shares at 39 in the previous autumn while the bear raid was in full cry, came to town to be in on the kill, unloaded his holdings at an average price of 105, and then caught an afternoon train back home, taking with him a profit of over $70,000. As it happened, he could have done even better if he had bided his time. By noon, or a little after, the price of Piggly Wiggly had risen to 124. And it seemed destined to zoom straight through the lofty roof above the traders' heads. But 124 was as high as it went, for that figure had barely been recorded when a rumor reached the floor that the governors of the exchange were meeting to consider the suspension of further trading in the stock and the postponement of the short sellers' deadline for delivery. The effect of such action would be to give the bears time to beat the bushes for stock, and thus to weaken, if not break, Saunders' corner. On the basis of the rumor alone, Piggly Wiggly fell to 82 by the time the exchange's closing bell ended the chaotic session. The rumor proved to be true. After the close of business, the governing committee of the exchange announced both the suspension of trading in Piggly Wiggly and the extension of the short sellers' delivery deadline until further action by this committee. There was no immediate official reason given for this decision, but some members of the committee unofficially let it be known that they had been afraid of a repetition of the Northern Pacific panic if the corner were not broken. On the other hand, irreverent sideliners were inclined to wonder whether the governing committee had not been moved by the pitiful plight of the cornered short sellers, many of whom, as in the Stutz Motor case 2 years earlier, were believed to be members of the exchange. Despite all this, Saunders in Memphis was in a jubilant, expansive mood that Tuesday evening. After all, his paper profits at that moment ran to several $1,000,000. The hitch, of course, was that he could not realize them. But he seems to have been slow to grasp that fact, or to understand the extent to which his position had been undermined. The indications are that he went to bed convinced that, besides having personally brought about a first-class mess on the hated stock exchange, he had made himself a bundle and had demonstrated how a poor Southern boy could teach the city slickers a lesson. It all must have added up to a heady sensation. But, like most such sensations, it didn't last long. By Wednesday evening, when Saunders issued his first public utterance on the Piggly crisis, his mood had changed to an odd mixture of puzzlement, defiance, and a somewhat muted echo of the crowing triumph of the night before. A razor to my throat, figuratively speaking, is why I suddenly and without warning kicked the pegs from under Wall Street and its gang of gamblers and market manipulators, he declared in a press interview. It was strictly a question of whether I should survive, and likewise my business and the fortunes of my friends, or whether I should be licked and pointed to as a boob from Tennessee. And the consequence was that the boastful and supposedly invulnerable Wall Street powers found their methods controverted by well-laid plans and quick action. Saunders wound up his statement by laying down his terms. The stock exchange's deadline extension notwithstanding, you would expect settlement in full-on all-short stock by 3 p.m. the next day, Thursday, at $150 a share. Thereafter, his price would be $250. On Thursday, to Saunders' surprise, very few short sellers came forward to settle. Presumably those who did couldn't stand the uncertainty. But then the governing committee kicked the pegs from under Saunders by announcing that the stock of Piggly Wiggly was permanently stricken from its trading list and that the short sellers would be given a full 5 days from the original deadline. That is until 2:15 the following Monday. That is until 2:15 the following Monday. Meet their obligations. In Memphis, Saunders, far removed from the scene though he was, could not miss the import of these moves. He was now on the losing end of things. Nor could he any longer fail to see that the postponement of the short seller's deadline was the vital issue. As I understand it, he said in another statement handed to reporters that evening, the failure of a broker to meet his clearings through the stock exchange at the appointed time is the same as a bank that would be unable to meet its clearings. And all of us know what would happen to that kind of a bank. The bank examiner would have a sign stuck up on the door with the word closed. It is unbelievable to me that the august and all-powerful New York Stock Exchange is a welcher. Therefore, I continue to believe that the HS shares of stock still due me on contracts will be settled on the proper basis. An editorial in the Memphis Commercial Appeal backed up Saunders' cry of treachery, declaring, "This looks like what gamblers call welching. We hope the homeboy beats them to a frazzle." That same Thursday, by a coincidence, the annual financial report of Piggly Wiggly Stores, Inc., was made public. It was a highly favorable one. Sales, profits, current assets, and all other significant figures were up sharply over the year before. Nobody paid any attention to it. For the moment, the real worth of the company was irrelevant. The point was the game. On Friday morning, the Piggly Wiggly bubble burst. It burst because Saunders, who had said his price would rise to $250 a share after 3 p.m. Thursday, made the startling announcement that he would settle for $100. A.W. Bradford, Saunders' New York lawyer, was asked why Saunders had suddenly granted this striking concession. Saunders had done it out of the generosity of his heart, Bradford replied gamely. But the truth was soon obvious. Saunders had made the concession because he'd had to. The postponement granted by the stock exchange had given the short sellers and their brokers a chance to scan lists of Piggly Wiggly stockholders. And from these they had been able to smoke out small blocks of shares that Saunders had not cornered. Widows and orphans in Albuquerque and Sioux City, who knew nothing about short sellers and corners, were only too happy, when pressed, to dig into their mattresses or safe deposit boxes and sell. In the so-called over-the-counter market, since the stock could no longer be traded on the exchange, their 10 or 20 shares of Piggly Wiggly for at least double what they had paid for them. Consequently, instead of having to buy stock from Saunders at his price of $250 and then hand it back to him in settlement of their loans, many of the short sellers were able to buy it and over the counter trading at around $100, and thus with bitter pleasure pay off their Memphis adversary not in cash, but in shares of Piggly Wiggly, the very last thing he wanted just then. By nightfall Friday, virtually all the short sellers were in the clear, having redeemed their indebtedness either by these over-the-counter purchases or by paying Saunders cash at his own suddenly deflated rate of $100 a share. That evening, Saunders released still another statement, and this one, while still defiant, was unmistakably a howl of anguish. Wall Street got licked and then called for mama, it read. Of all the institutions in America, the New York Stock Exchange is the worst menace of all in its power to ruin all who dare to oppose it. A law unto itself, a law unto itself, an association of men who claim the right that no king or autocrat ever dared to take, to make a rule that applies one day on contract, abrogate it the next day to let out a bunch of welchers. My whole life from this day on will be aimed toward the end of having the public protected from a like occurrence. I am not afraid. Let Wall Street get me if they can. But it appeared that Wall Street had got him. His corner was broken, leaving him deeply in debt to the syndicate of Southern bankers and encumbered with a mountain of stock whose immediate future was, to say the least, precarious. Sondy's fulminations did not go unheeded on Wall Street, and as a result, the exchange felt compelled to justify itself. On Monday, March 26th, shortly after the Piggly Wiggly short sellers deadline had passed, and Saunders' corner was, for all practical purposes, a dead issue, the exchange offered its apologia in the form of a lengthy review of the crisis from beginning to end. In presenting its case, the exchange emphasized the public harm that might have been done if the corner had gone unbroken, explaining, the enforcement simultaneously of all contracts for the return of the stock would have forced the stock to any price that might be fixed by Mr. Saunders, and competitive bidding for the insufficient supply might have brought about conditions illustrated by other corners, notably the Northern Pacific corner in 1901. Then, its syntax yielding to its sincerity, the exchange went on to say that the demoralizing effects of such a situation are not limited to those directly affected by the contracts, but extends to the whole market, getting down to the two specific actions it had taken, the suspension of trading in Piggly Wiggly and the extension of the short sellers deadline. The exchange argued that both of them were within the bounds of its own constitution and rules, and therefore irreproachable. Arrogant as this may sound now, the exchange had a point. In those days, its rules were just about the only controls over stock trading. The question of whether, even by their own rules, the slickers really played fair with the Bob is still debated among fiscal antiquarians. There is strong presumptive evidence that the slickers themselves later came to have their doubts. Regarding the right of the exchange to suspend trading in a stock, there can be no argument, since the right was, as the exchange claimed at the time, specifically granted in its constitution. But the right to postpone the deadline for short sellers to honor their contracts, though also claimed at the time, is another matter. In June 1925, 2 years after Saunders' corner, the exchange felt constrained to amend its constitution with an article stating that whenever, in the opinion of the governing committee, a corner has been created in a security listed on the exchange, the governing committee may postpone the time for deliveries on exchange contracts therein. By adopting a statute authorizing it to do what it had done long before, the exchange would seem, at the very least, to have exposed a guilty conscience. The immediate aftermath of the Piggly crisis was a wave of sympathy for Saunders. Throughout the hinterland, the public image of him became that of a gallant champion of the underdog who had been ruthlessly crushed. Even in New York, the very lair of the stock exchange, the Times conceded in an editorial that in the minds of many people Saunders represented St. George and the stock exchange, the dragon. That the dragon triumphed in the end, said the Times, was bad news for a nation at least 66.23% sucker, which had its moment of triumph when it read that a sucker had trimmed the interests and had his foot on Wall Street's neck, while the vicious manipulators gasped their lives away. Not a man to ignore such a host of friendly fellow suckers, Saunders went to work to turn them to account. And he needed them, for his position was perilous indeed. His biggest problem was what to do about the $10 million that he owed his banker backers and didn't have. The basic plan behind his corner, if he had had any plan at all, must have been to make such a killing that he could pay back a big slice of his debt out of the profits, pay back the rest out of the proceeds from his public stock sale, and then walk off with a still huge block of Piggly Wiggly stock, free and clear. Even though the cut-rate $100 settlement had netted him a killing by most men's standards, just how much of a killing is not known, but it has been reliably estimated at $500,000 or so. It was not a fraction of what he might have reasonably expected it to be, and because it was, his whole structure became an arch without a keystone. Having paid his bankers what he had received from the short sellers and from his public stock sale, Saunders found that he still owed them about $5 million, half of it due September 1, 1923, and the balance on January 1, 1924. His best hope of raising the money lay in selling more of the vast bundle of Piggly Wiggly shares he still had on hand. Since he could no longer sell them on the exchange, he resorted to his favorite form of self-expression, newspaper advertising, this time supplemented with a mail-order pitch offering Piggly Wiggly again at $55. It soon became evident, though, that public sympathy was one thing and public willingness to translate sympathy into cash was quite another. Everyone, whether in New York, Memphis, or Texarkana, knew about the recent speculative shenanigans in Piggly Wiggly and about the dubious state of the president's finances. Not even Saunders' fellow suckers would have any part of his deal now, and the campaign was a bleak failure. Sadly accepting this fact, Saunders next appealed to the local and regional pride of his Memphis neighbors by turning his remarkable powers of persuasion to the job of convincing them that his financial dilemma was a civics issue. If he should go broke, he argued, it would reflect not only on the character and business acumen of Memphis, but on Southern honor in general. "I do not ask for charity," he wrote in one of the large ads he always seemed able to find the cash for, "and I do not request any flowers for my financial funeral, but I do ask everybody in Memphis to recognize and know that this is a serious statement made for the purpose of acquainting those who wish to assist in this matter, that they may work with me and with other friends and believers in my business, in a Memphis campaign to have every man and woman who possibly can in this city become one of the partners of the Piggly Wiggly business, because it is a good investment first, and second, because it is the right thing to do." Raising his sights in a second ad, he declared, "For Piggly Wiggly to be ruined would shame the whole South." Just which argument proved the clincher in persuading Memphis that it should try to pull Saunders' chestnuts out of the fire is hard to say, but some part of his line of reasoning clicked. And soon, the Memphis commercial appeal was urging the town to get behind the embattled local boy. The response of the city's business leaders was truly inspiring to Saunders. A whirlwind, 3-day campaign was planned, with the object of selling 50,000 shares of his stock to the citizens of Memphis at the old magic figure of $55 a share, in order to give buyers some degree of assurance that they would not later find themselves alone out on a limb. It was stipulated that unless the whole block was sold within the 3 days, all sales would be called off. The Chamber of Commerce sponsored the drive. The American Legion, the Civitan Club, and the Exchange Club fell into line, and even the Bauer stores and the Arrow stores, both competitors of Piggly Wiggly in Memphis, agreed to plug the worthy cause. Hundreds of civics-minded volunteers signed up to ring doorbells. On May 3rd, 5 days before the scheduled start of the campaign, 250 Memphis businessmen assembled at the Gayoso Hotel for a kickoff dinner. There were cheers when Saunders, accompanied by his wife, entered the dining room. One of the many after-dinner speakers described him as the man who has done more for Memphis than any in the last 1,000 years. A rousing tribute that put God knew how many Chickasaw chiefs in their place. Business rivalries and personal differences were swept away like mists before the sun. A commercial appeal reporter wrote of the dinner, "The drive got off to a splendid start." On the opening day, May 8th, society women and Boy Scouts paraded the streets of Memphis wearing badges that read, "We're 100% for Clarence Saunders and Piggly Wiggly." Merchants adorned their windows with placards bearing the slogan, "A share of Piggly Wiggly stock in every home." Telephones and doorbells rang incessantly. In short order, 23,698 of the 50,000 shares had been subscribed for. Yet at the very moment when most of Memphis had become miraculously convinced that the peddling of Piggly Wiggly stock was an activity fully as uplifting as soliciting for the Red Cross or the community chest, ugly doubts were brewing, and some vipers in the home nest suddenly demanded that Saunders consent to an immediate spot audit of his company's books. Saunders, for whatever reasons, refused, but offered to placate the skeptics by stepping down as president of Piggly Wiggly if such a move would facilitate the stock-selling campaign. He was not asked to give up the presidency, but on May 9th, the second day of the campaign, a watchdog committee of 4, 3 bankers and a businessman, was appointed by the Piggly Wiggly directors to help him run the company for an interim period while the dust settled. That same day, Saunders was confronted with another embarrassing situation. Why the campaign leaders wanted to know, was he continuing to build his $1 million pink palace at a time when the whole town was working for him for nothing? He replied hastily that he would have the place boarded up the very next day and that there would be no further construction until his financial future looked bright again. The confusion attendant on these two issues brought the drive to a standstill. At the end of the third day, the total number of shares subscribed for was still under 25,000, and the sales that had been made were canceled. Saunders had to admit that the drive had been a failure. "Memphis has fizzled," he reportedly added, although he was at great pains to deny this a few years later when he needed more of Memphis's money for a new venture. It would not be surprising, though, if he had made some such imprudent remark, for he was understandably suffering from a case of frazzled nerves and was showing distraint. Just before the announcement of the campaign's unhappy end, he went into a closed conference with several Memphis business leaders and came out of it with a bruised cheekbone and a torn collar. None of the other men at the meeting showed any marks of violence. It just wasn't Saunders' day. Although it was never established that Saunders had had his hand improperly in the Piggly Wiggly corporate till during his cornering operation, his first business move after the collapse of his attempt to unload stock suggested that he had at least had good reason to refuse a spot audit of the company's books. In spite of futile grunts of protest from the watchdog committee, he began selling not Piggly Wiggly stock but Piggly Wiggly stores, partly liquidating the company, that is, and no one knew where he would stop. The Chicago stores went first, and those in Denver and Kansas City soon followed. His announced intention was to build up the company's treasury so that it could buy the stock that the public had spurned, but there was some suspicion that the treasury desperately needed a transfusion just then, and not of Piggly Wiggly stock either. "I've got Wall Street and the whole gang licked," Saunders reported cheerfully in June. But in mid-August, with the September 1st deadline for repayment of $2.5 million on his loan staring him in the face and with nothing like that amount of cash either on hand or in prospect, he resigned as president of Piggly Wiggly Stores, Inc. and turned over his assets, stock in the company, his pink palace, and all the rest of his property, to his creditors. It remained only for the formal stamp of failure to be put on Saunders personally and on Piggly Wiggly under his management. On August 22nd, the New York auction firm of Adrian Haight, Muller EET, Son, which dealt in so many next to worthless stocks that its sales room was often called the securities graveyard, knocked down 1,500 shares of Piggly Wiggly at $1 a share, the traditional price for securities that had been run into the ground, and the following spring Saunders went through formal bankruptcy proceedings. But these were anticlimaxes. The real low point of Saunders' career was probably the day he was forced out of his company's presidency, and it was then that, in the opinion of many of his admirers, he achieved his rhetorical peak, when he emerged, harassed but still defiant, from a directors' conference and announced his resignation to reporters. A hush fell. Then Saunders added hoarsely, "They have the body of Piggly Wiggly, but they cannot have the soul." If by the soul of Piggly Wiggly Saunders meant himself, then it did remain free to go marching on in its own erratic way. He never ventured to play another game of corner, but his spirit was far from broken. Although officially bankrupt, he managed to find people of truly rock-like faith who were still willing to finance him, and they enabled him to live on a scale only slightly less grand than in the past. Reduced to playing golf at the Memphis Country Club rather than on his own private course, he handed out caddy tips that the club governors considered as corrupting as ever. To be sure, he no longer owned the Pink Palace, but this was about the only evidence that served to remind his fellow townsmen of his misfortune. Eventually, the unfinished Pleasure Dome came into the hands of the city of Memphis, which appropriated $150,000 to finish it and turn it into a museum of natural history and industrial arts. As such, it continues to sustain the Saunders legend in Memphis. After his downfall, Saunders spent the better part of 3 years in seeking redress of the wrongs that he felt he had suffered in the Piggly Wiggly fight, and in foiling the efforts of his enemies and creditors to make things still more unpleasant for him. For a while, he kept threatening to sue the stock exchange for conspiracy and breach of contract, but a test suit brought by some small Piggly Wiggly stockholders failed, and he dropped the idea. Then, in January 1926, he learned that a federal indictment was about to be brought against him for using the mails to defraud in his mail order campaign to sell his Piggly Wiggly stock. He believed incorrectly that the government had been egged on to bring the indictment by an old associate of his, John C. Birch of Memphis, who had become secretary-treasurer of Piggly Wiggly after the shakeup. His patience once more exhausted, Saunders went around to Piggly Wiggly headquarters and confronted Birch. This conference proved far more satisfactory to Saunders than his board. Room scuffle on the day the Memphis civic stock selling drive failed. Birch, according to Saunders, undertook in a stammering way to deny the accusation, whereupon Saunders delivered a right to the jaw, knocking off Birch's glasses but not doing much other damage. Birch afterward belittled the blow as glancing, and added an alibi that sounded like that of any outpointed pugilist. The assault upon me was made so suddenly that I did not have time or opportunity to strike Mr. Saunders. Birch refused to press charges. About a month later, the mail fraud indictment was brought against Saunders. But by that time, satisfied that Birch was innocent of any dirty work, he was his amiable old self again. "I have only one thing to regret in this new affair," he announced pleasantly, "and that is my fistic encounter with John C. Birch." The new affair didn't last long. In April, the indictment was quashed by the Memphis District Court, and Saunders and Piggly Wiggly were finally quit. By then, the company was well on its way back up, and with a greatly changed corporate structure, it flourished on into the 1960s. Housewives continued to ramble down the aisles of hundreds of Piggly Wiggly stores, now operated under a franchise agreement with the Piggly Wiggly Corporation of Jacksonville, Florida. Saunders, too, was well on his way back up. In 1928, he started a new grocery chain, which he, but hardly anyone else, called the Clarence Saunders, sole owner of My Name Stores, Inc. Its outlets soon came to be known as sole owner stores, which was precisely what they weren't. For without Saunders' faithful backers, they would have existed only in his mind. Saunders' choice of a corporate title, however, was not designed to mislead the public. Rather, it was his ironic way of reminding the world that, after the skinning Wall Street had given him, his name was about the only thing he still had a clear title to. How many sole owner customers, or governors of the stock exchange for that matter, got the point is questionable. In any case, the new stores caught on so rapidly and did so well that Saunders leaped back up from bankruptcy to riches and bought $1 million estate just outside Memphis. He also organized and underwrote a professional football team called the Sole Owner Tigers, an investment that paid off handsomely on the fall afternoons when he could hear cries of "Rah! Rah! Rah! Sole owner! Sole owner! Sole owner!" ringing through the Memphis Stadium. For the second time, Saunders' glory was fleeting. The very first wave of the Depression hit sole owner stores such a crushing blow that in 1930 they went bankrupt and he was broke again. But again, he pulled himself together and survived the debacle. Finding backers, he planned a new chain of grocery stores and thought up a name for it that was more outlandish, if possible, than either of its predecessors: E. Dizzoli. He never made another killing, however, or bought another $1 million estate, though it was always clear that he expected to. His hopes were pinned on the Key-Doozle, an electrically operated grocery store, and he spent the better part of the last 20 years of his life trying to perfect it. In a Key-Doozle store, the merchandise was displayed behind glass panels, each with a slot beside it, like the food in an automatic. There, the similarity ended, for instead of inserting coins in the slot to open a panel and lift out a purchase, Key-Doozle customers inserted a key that they were given on entering the store. Moreover, Saunders' thinking had advanced far beyond the elementary stage of having the key open the panel. Each time a Key-Doozle key was inserted in a slot, the identity of the item selected was inscribed in code on a segment of recording tape embedded in the key itself, and simultaneously the item was automatically transferred to a conveyor belt that carried it to an exit gate at the front of the store. When a customer had finished his shopping, he would present his key to an attendant at the gate, who would decipher the tape and add up the bill. As soon as this was paid, the purchases would be catapulted into the customer's arms, all bagged and wrapped by a device at the end of the conveyor belt. A couple of pilot Key-Doozle stores were tried out, one in Memphis and the other in Chicago, but it was found that the machinery was too complex and expensive to compete with supermarket pushcarts. Undeterred, Saunders set to work on an even more intricate mechanism, the foot electric, which would do everything the Key-Doozle could do and add up the bill as well. It will never corner the retail store equipment market, though, because it was still unfinished when Saunders died in October 1953. 5 years too soon for him to see the Bruce corner, which in any case he would have been fully entitled to scoff at as a mere squabble among ribbon clerks. Chapter 9. A Second Sort of Life. During Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency, when Wall Street and Washington tended to be on cat and dog terms, perhaps no New Dealer other than that man himself better typified the New Deal in the eyes of Wall Street than David Ely Lilienthal. The explanation of this estimate of him in southern Manhattan lay not in any specific anti-Wall Street acts of Lilienthal's. Indeed, the scattering of financiers, among them Wendell L. Willkie, who had personal dealings with him, generally found him to be a reasonable sort of fellow, but in what he had come to symbolize through his association with the Tennessee Valley Authority, which as a government owned an electric power concern far larger than any private power corporation in the country, embodied Wall Street's notion of galloping socialism. Because Lilienthal was a conspicuous and vigorous member of the TVA's three-man board of directors from 1933 until 1941, and was its chairman from 1941 until 1946. The business community of that period, in his phrase, thought he wore horns. In 1946, he became the first chairman of the United States Atomic Energy Commission, and when he gave up that position in February 1950, at the age of 50, the Times said in a news story that he had been perhaps the most controversial figure in Washington since the end of the war. What has Lilienthal been up to in the years since he left the government? As a matter of public record, he has been up to a number of things. All of them, surprisingly, centered on Wall Street or on private business, or both. For one thing, Lilienthal is listed in any number of business compendiums as the co-founder and the chairman of the board of the Development Resources Corporation. Several years ago, I phoned ERA's offices, then at 50 Broadway, New York City, and discovered it to be a private firm. Wall Street, backed as well as, give or take a block, Wall Street based, that provides managerial, technical, business and planning services toward the development of natural resources abroad. That is to say, DDER, whose other co-founder, the Latte Gordon R. Clapp, was Lilienthal's successor as TVA chairman, is in the business of helping governments set up programs more or less similar to the TVA. Since its formation in 1955, I learned EDEER had, at moderate but gratifying profit to itself, planned and managed the beginnings of a vast scheme for the reclamation of Khuzestan, an arid and poverty-stricken, though oil-rich region of western Iran, advised the government of Italy on the development of its backward southern provinces, helped the Republic of Colombia set up a TVA, like authority for its potentially fertile but flood-plagued Cauca Valley, and offered advice to Ghana on water supply, to the Ivory Coast on mineral development, and to Puerto Rico on electric power and atomic energy. For another thing, and when I found out about this, it struck me as considerably more astonishing, on form, than DEUR. Lilienthal has made an authentic fortune as a corporate officer and entrepreneur. In a proxy statement of the Minerals Chemicals Corporation of America, dated June 24, 1960, that fell into my hands, I found Lilienthal listed as a director of the firm and the holder of 41,366 shares of its common stock. These shares at the time of my investigation were being traded on the New York Stock Exchange at something over $25 each, and simple multiplication revealed that they represented a thumping sum by most men's standards, certainly including those of a man who had spent most of his life on government wages without the help of private resources. And for still another thing, in 1953, Harper Ruta Brothers brought out Lilienthal's third book, Big Business, A New Era. His previous books were TVA, Democracy on the March, and This I Do Believe, which appeared in 1944 and 1949, respectively. In Big Business, Lilienthal argues that not only the productive and distributive superiority of the United States, but also its national security depends on industrial bigness, that we now have adequate public safeguards against abuses of big business, or know well enough how to fashion them as required. That big business does not tend to destroy small business, as is often supposed, but rather tends to promote it. And finally, that a big business society does not suppress individualism, as most intellectuals believe, but actually tends to encourage it by reducing poverty, disease, and physical insecurity and increasing the opportunities for leisure and travel. Fighting words, in short, from an old New Dealer. Lilienthal is a man whose government career as a man whose government career as a newspaper reader had followed fairly closely. My interest in him as a government official had reached its peak in February 1947, when, in answer to a fierce attack on him by his old enemy Senator Kenneth D. McKellar of Tennessee during congressional hearings on his fitness for the ELC job, he uttered a spontaneous statement of personal democratic faith that for many people still ranks as one of the most stirring attacks on what later came to be known as McCarthyism. One of the tenets of democracy that grow out of this central core of a belief that the individual comes first, that all men are the children of God and their personalities are therefore sacred, Lilienthal said, among other things, is a deep belief in civil liberties and their protection, and a repugnance to anyone who would steal from a human being that which is most precious to him, his good name, by imputing things to him, by innuendo or by insinuation, the fragments of information I picked up about his new private career left me confused, wondering how Wall Street and business life had affected Lilienthal and vice versa in their belated rapprochement. I got in touch with him, and a day or so later, at his invitation, drove out to New Jersey to spend the afternoon with him. Lilienthal and his wife, Helen Lamb Lilienthal, lived on Battle Road in Princeton, where they had settled in 1957 after 6 years in New York City, at first in a house on Beekman Place and later in an apartment on Sutton Place. The Princeton house, which stands in a plot of less than an acre, is of Georgian brick with green shutters. Surrounded by other houses of its kind, the place is capacious yet anything but pretentious. Lilienthal, wearing gray slacks and a plaid sports shirt, met me at the front door. At just past 60, he was a tall, trim man with a receding hairline, a slightly hawk-like profile, and candid, piercing eyes. He led me into the living room where he introduced Mrs. Lilienthal and then pointed out a couple of household treasures. A large oriental rug in front of the fireplace, which he said was a gift from the Shah of Iran, and, hanging on the wall opposite the fireplace, a Chinese scroll of the late 19th century showing 4 rather roguish men who, he told me, have a special meaning for him, since they are upper middle-rank civil servants, pointing to a particularly enigmatic-looking fellow. He added with a smile that he always thought of that one as his oriental counterpart. Mrs. Lilienthal went to get coffee, and while she was gone, I asked Lilienthal to tell me something of his post. Government life, starting at the beginning. All right, he said. The beginning. I left the AAUCC for a number of reasons. In that kind of work, I feel a fellow is highly expendable. If you stayed too long, you might find yourself placating industry or the military, or both, building up what would amount to an atomic pork barrel. Another thing, I wanted to be allowed to speak my mind more freely than I could as a government official. I felt I'd served my term, so I turned in my resignation in November 1949, and it went into effect 3 months later. As for the timing, I resigned then because for once I wasn't under fire. Originally, I'd planned to do it earlier in 1949, but then came the last congressional attack on me. The time Hickenlooper of Iowa accused me of incredible mismanagement. I noticed that Lilienthal did not smile in referring to the Hickenlooper affair. I entered private life with both trepidation and relief, he went on. The trepidation was about my ability to make a living, and it was very real. Oh, I'd been a practicing lawyer as a young man in Chicago before going into government work and made quite a lot of money at it too. But now I didn't want to practice law, and I was worried about what else I could do. I was so obsessed with the subject that I harped on it all the time, and my wife and my friends began to kid me. That Christmas of 1949, my wife gave me a beggar's tin cup, and one of my friends gave me a guitar to go with it. The feeling of relief. Well, that was a matter of personal privacy and freedom. As a private citizen, I wouldn't have to be trailed around by hordes of security officers as I had been at the ASA. I wouldn't have to answer the charges of congressional committees. And, above all, I'd be able to talk freely to my wife again. Mrs. Lilienthal had returned with the coffee as her husband was talking, and now she sat down with us. She comes, I knew, from a family of pioneers who, over several generations, moved westward from New England to Ohio, to Indiana, to Ohio, to Indiana, to Oklahoma, where she was born. She seemed to me to look the part, that of a woman of dignity, patience, practicality, and gentle strength. I can tell you that my husband's resignation was a relief to me, she said. Before he went with the AEC, we'd always talked over all aspects of his work. When he took that job, we agreed between us that although we'd indulge in the discussion of personalities as freely as we pleased, he would never tell me anything about the work of the AEC that I couldn't read in the newspapers. It was a terrible constraint to be under. Lilienthal nodded. I'd come home at night with some frightful experience in me, he said. No one who so much as touches the atom is ever quite the same again. Perhaps I'd have been in a series of conferences and listened to the kind of talk that many military and scientific men go in for. Cities full of human beings referred to as targets and that sort of thing. I never got used to that impersonal jargon. I'd come home sick at heart, but I couldn't talk about it to Helen. I wasn't allowed to get it off my chest, and now there wouldn't be any more hearings, Mrs. Lilienthal said. Those terrible hearings. I'll never forget one Washington cocktail party we went to for our sins. My husband had been going through one of the endless series of congressional hearings. A woman in a funny hat came gushing up to him and said something like, "Oh, Mr. Lilienthal, I was so anxious to come to your hearings, but I just couldn't make it. I'm so sorry. I just love hearings, don't you?" Husband and wife looked at each other, and this time Lilienthal managed a grin. Lilienthal seemed glad to get on to what happened next. At about the time his resignation became effective, he told me he was approached by various men from Harvard representing the fields of history, public administration, and law who asked him to accept an appointment to the faculty. But he decided he didn't want to become a professor any more than he wanted to practice law. Within the next few weeks came offers from numerous law firms in New York and Washington and from some industrial companies. Reassured by these that he was not going to need the tin cup and guitar after all, Lilienthal, after mulling over the offers, finally turned them all down and settled, in May 1950, for a part-time job as a consultant to the celebrated banking firm of Lazard Freezer Company, whose senior partner, Andre Mayer, he had met through Albert Lasker, a mutual friend. Lazard gave him an office in its headquarters at 44 Wall. But before he could do much consulting, he was off on a lecture tour across the United States, followed by a trip to Europe that summer with his wife on behalf of the late Collier's magazine. The trip did not result in any articles, though, and on returning home in the fall he found it necessary to get back on a full-time income, producing basis. This he did by becoming a consultant to various other companies, among them the Carrier Corporation and the Radio Corporation of America. To Carrier, he offered advice on managerial problems. For RCA, he worked on the question of color television, ultimately advising his client to concentrate on technical research rather than on law, court squabbles over patents. He also helped persuade the company to press its computer program and to stay out of the construction of atomic reactors. Early in 1951, he took another trip abroad for Collier's, to India, Pakistan, Thailand, and Japan. This trip produced an article, published in Collier's that August, in which he proposed a solution to the dispute between India and Pakistan over Kashmir and the headwaters of the Indus River. Lilienthal's idea was that the tension between the two countries could best be lessened by a cooperative program to improve living conditions in the whole disputed area through economic development of the Indus Basin. 9 years later, largely through the financial backing and moral support of Eugene R. Black and the World Bank, the Lilienthal Plan was essentially adopted and an Indus Treaty signed between India and Pakistan. But the immediate reaction to his article was general indifference, and Lilienthal, temporarily stymied and considerably disillusioned, once more settled down to the humbler problems of private business. At this point in Lilienthal's narrative, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Lilienthal went to answer it, and I could hear her talking to someone, a gardener evidently, about the pruning of some roses. After listening restlessly for a minute or two, Lilienthal called to his wife, Helen. "Please tell Dominic to prune those roses farther back than he did last year." Mrs. Lilienthal went outside with Dominic, and Lilienthal remarked, "Dominic always prunes too gently to my way of thinking. It's a case of our backgrounds, Italy versus the Middle West." Then, resuming where he had left off, he said that his association with Lazard Freres, and more particularly with Mayer, had led him into an association first as a consultant and later as an executive with a small company called the Mineral Separation North American Corporation, in which Lazard Freres had a large interest. It was in this undertaking that, unexpectedly, he made his fortune. The company was in trouble, and Mayer's notion was that Lilienthal might be the man to do something about it. Subsequently, in the course of a series of mergers, acquisitions, and other maneuvers, the company's name was changed to, successively, the Attapulgis Minerals Chemicals Corporation, the Minerals Chemicals Corporation, the Minerals Chemicals Corporation of America, and in 1960, the Minerals Chemicals Philip Corporation. Meanwhile, its annual receipts rose from about $750,000 for 1952 to something over $274 million for 1960. For Lilienthal, the acceptance of Mayer's commission to look into the company's affairs was the beginning of a 4-year immersion in the day-to-day problems of managing a business. The experience, he said decisively, turned out to be one of his life's richest, and by no means only in the literal sense of that word. I have reconstructed the corporate facts behind Lilienthal's experience, partly from what he told me in Princeton, partly from a subsequent study of some of the company's published documents, and partly from talks with other persons interested in the firm. Minerals Separation North American, which was founded in 1916 as an offshoot of a British firm, was a patent company deriving its chief income from royalties on patents for processes used in refining copper ore and the ores of other non-ferrous minerals. Its activities were twofold: attempting to develop new patents in its research laboratory and offering technical services to the mining and manufacturing companies that leased its old ones. By 1950, although it was still netting a nice annual profit, it was in a bad way. Under the direction of its longtime president, Dr. Seth Gregory, who was then over 90 but still ruled the company with an iron hand, commuting daily between his Midtown apartment hotel and his office at 11 Broadway in a regally purple Rolls Royce. It had cut down its research activities to almost nothing and was living on half a dozen old patents, all of which were scheduled to go into the public domain in from 5 to 8 years. In effect, it was a still healthy company living under a death sentence. Lazard Frères, as a large stockholder, was understandably concerned. Dr. Gregory was persuaded to retire on a handsome pension, and in February 1952, after working with Mineral Separation for some time as a consultant, Lilienthal was installed as the company's president and a member of its board of directors. His first task was to find a new source of income to replace the fast expiring patents, and he and the other directors agreed that the way to accomplish this was through a merger. It fell to Lilienthal to participate in arranging one between Mineral Separation and another company in which Lazard Frères, along with the Wall Street firm of F. Eberstadt Eich Company, had large holdings. The Attapulgis Clay Company of Attapulgis, Georgia, which produced a very rare kind of clay that is useful in purifying petroleum products, and which manufactured various household products, among them a floor cleaner called Speedy Dry. As a marriage broker between Mineral Separation and Attapulgis, Lilienthal had the touchy job of persuading the executives of the Southern Company that they were not being used as pawns by a bunch of rapacious Wall Street bankers. Being an agent of the bankers was an unaccustomed role for Lilienthal, but he evidently carried it off with aplomb despite the fact that his presence complicated the emotional problems still further by introducing into the situation a whiff of galloping socialism. Dave was very effective in building up the Attapulgis people's morale and confidence. Another Wall Streeter has told me. He reconciled them to the merger and showed them its advantages for them. Lilienthal himself told me, "I felt at home in the administrative and technical parts of the job, but the financial part had to be done by the people from Lazard and Eberstadt. Every time they began talking about spin-offs and exchanges of shares, I was lost. I didn't even know what a spin-off was." As Lilienthal knows now, it is not to get too technical about it, a division of a company into two or more companies, the opposite of a merger. The merger took place in December 1952, and neither the Attapulgis people nor the Mineral Separation people had any reason to regret it, because both the profits and the stock price of the newly formed company, the Attapulgis Minerals Chemicals Corporation, soon began to rise. At the time of the merger, Lilienthal was made chairman of the board of directors at an annual salary of $18,000. Over the next 3 years, while serving first in this position and later as chairman of the executive committee, he had a large part not only in the conduct of the company's routine affairs, but also in its further growth through a series of new mergers. One in 1954 with Edgar Brothers, a leading producer of kaolin for paper coating, and two in 1955 with a pair of limestone concerns in Ohio and Virginia. The mergers and the increased efficiency that went with them were not long in paying off. Between 1952 and 1955, the company's net profit per share more than quintupled. The mechanics of Lilienthal's own rise from the comparative rags of a public servant to the riches of a successful entrepreneur are baldly outlined in the company's proxy statements for its annual and special stockholders' meetings. There are few public documents more indiscreet than proxy statements in which the precise private stock holdings of directors must be listed. In November 1952, Mineral Separation North American granted Lilienthal, as a supplement to his annual salary, a stock option. His option entitled him to buy as many as 50,000 shares of the firm's stock from its treasury at $4.87, $5 per share, then the going rate, any time before the end of 1955, and in exchange, he signed a contract agreeing to serve the company as an active executive throughout 1953, 1954, and 1955. The potential financial advantage to him, of course, as to all other recipients of stock options, lay in the fact that if the price of the stock rose substantially, he could buy shares at the option price, and thus have a holding that would immediately be worth much more than he paid for it. Furthermore, and more important, if he should later decide to sell his shares, the proceeds would be a capital gain, taxable at a maximum rate of 25, of course. If the stock failed to go up, the option would be worthless. But, like so many stocks of the mid-50s, Lilienthal's did go up, fantastically. By the end of 1954, according to the proxy statements, Lilienthal had exercised his option to the extent of buying 12,750 shares, which were then worth not $4.875 each, but about $20. In February 1955, he sold off 4,000 shares at $22.75 each, bringing in $91,000. This sum, less capital gains tax, was then applied against further purchases under the option, and in August 1955, the proxy statements show Lilienthal raised his holdings to almost 40,000 shares, or close to the number he held at the time of my visit to him. By that time, the stock, which had at first been sold over the counter, not only had achieved a listing on the New York Stock Exchange, but had become one of the exchange's high-flying speculative favorites. Its price had skyrocketed to about $40 a share, and Lilienthal, obviously, was solidly in the millionaire class. Moreover, the company was now on a sound long-term basis, paying an annual cash dividend of 50 cents a share, and the Lilienthal family's financial worries were permanently over. Fiscally speaking, Lilienthal told me, his symbolic moment of triumph was the day, in June of 1955, when the shares of Minerals Chemicals graduated to a listing on the New York Stock Exchange. In accordance with custom, Lilienthal, as a top officer, was invited onto the floor to shake hands with the president of the exchange and be shown around generally. I went through it in a daze, Lilienthal told me. Until then, I'd never been inside any stock exchange in my life. It was all mysterious and fascinating. No zoo could have seemed more strange to me. How the stock exchange felt at this stage about having the former wearer of horns on its floor is not recorded. In telling me about his experience with the company, Lilienthal had spoken with zest and had made the whole thing sound mysterious and fascinating. I asked him what, apart from the obvious financial inducement, had led him to devote himself to the affairs of a small firm, and how it had felt for the former boss of TVA and AEC to be, in effect, peddling a tapplegate, kaolin, limestone, and speed. Lilienthal leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. I wanted an entrepreneurial experience, he said. I found a great appeal in the idea of taking a small and quite crippled company and trying to make something of it. Building. That kind of building, I thought, is the central thing in American free enterprise, and something I'd missed in all my government work. I wanted to try my hand at it. Now. About how it felt. Well, it felt plenty exciting. It was full of intellectual stimulation, and a lot of my old ideas changed. I conceived a great new respect for financiers. Men like Andre Mayer. There's a correctness about them, a certain high sense of honor that I'd never had any conception of. I found that business life is full of creative, original minds, along with the usual number of second-guessers, of course. Furthermore, I found it seductive. In fact, I was in danger of becoming a slave. Business has its man-eating side and part of the man-eating side is that it's so absorbing. I found that the things you read, for instance that acquiring money for its own sake can become an addiction if you're not careful, are literally true. Certain good friends helped keep me on the track. Men like Ferdinand Eberstadt, who became my fellow director after the Attapulgis merger, and Nathan Green, special counsel to Lazard Freires, who was on the board for a while. Green was a kind of business father confessor to me. I remember his saying, "You think you'll make your pile and then be independent? My friend, in Wall Street, you don't just win your independence at one stroke. To paraphrase Thomas Jefferson, you have to win your independence over again every day." I found that he was right about that. Oh, I had my problems. I questioned myself at every step. It was exhausting. You see, for so long I'd been associated with two pretty far-reaching things. Institutions. I had a feeling of identity with them. In that kind of work, you were able to lose your sense of self. Now, with myself to worry about, my personal standards as well as my financial future, I found myself wondering all the time whether I was making the right movie. But that part's all in my journal, and you can read it there if you like. I said I certainly would like to read it, and Lilienthal led me to his study, in the basement. It proved to be a good-sized room whose windows opened on window wells into which strands of ivy were trailing. Light came in from outside and even a little slanting sunshine, but the tops of the window wells were too high to permit a view of the garden or the neighborhood. Lilienthal remarked, "My neighbor Robert Oppenheimer complained about the enclosed feeling when he first saw this room. I told him that was just the feeling I wanted." Then he showed me a filing cabinet standing in a corner. It contained the journal and rows of loose-leaf notebooks, the earliest of them dating back to its author's high school days. Having invited me to make myself at home, Lilienthal left me alone in his study and went back upstairs. Taking him at his word, I went for a turn or two around the room, looking at the pictures on the walls and finding about what might have been expected. Inscribed photographs from Franklin D. Roosevelt, Harry S. Truman, Senator George Norris, Louis Brandeis. Pictures of Lilienthal with Roosevelt, with Wilkie, with Fiorello LaGuardia, with Nelson Rockefeller, with Nehru in India. A night view of the Fontana Dam in the Tennessee Valley being built under a blaze of electricity supplied by TVA. Power plants. A man's study reflects himself as he wishes to be seen publicly. But his journal, if he is honest, reflects something else. I had not browsed long in Lilienthal's journal before I realized that it was an extraordinary document. Not merely a historical source of unusual interest, but a searching record of a public man's thoughts and emotions. I leafed through the years of his association with minerals, chemicals, and scattered amid much about family, democratic politics, friends, trips abroad, reflections on national policies, and hopes and fears for the Republic. I came upon the following entries having to do with business and life. In New York, May 24, 1951. Looks as if I am in the minerals business. In a small way, that could become a big way. He goes on to explain that he has just had his first interview with Dr. Gregory and is apparently acceptable to the old man as the new president of the company. May 31, 1951. 1951. Starting in business is like learning to walk after a long illness. At first you have to think, move the right foot, move the left foot, etc. Then you are walking without thinking, and then walking is something one does with unconsciousness and utter confidence. This latter state, as to business, has yet to come, but I had the first touch of it today. July 22, 1951. I recall Wendell Willkie saying to me years ago, living in New York is a great experience. I wouldn't live anywhere else. It is the most exciting, stimulating, satisfying spot in the world. Otset. I think this was apropos of some remark I had made on a business visit to New York, that I was certainly glad I didn't have to live in that madhouse of noise and dirt. Last Thursday was a day in which I shared some of Willkie's feeling. There was a grandeur about the place, an adventure, a sense of being in the center of a great achievement. New York City in the 50s. October 28, 1951. What I'm reaching for perhaps is to have my cake and eat it too. But in a way this is not wholly senseless nor futile. That is, I can have enough actual contact with the affairs of business to keep a sense of reality, or develop one. How otherwise can I explain the pleasure I get in visiting a copper mine or talking to operators of an electric furnace or a coal research project, or watching how Andre Mayer works? But along with that, I want to be free enough to think about what these things mean, free enough to read outside. The immediate field of interest. This requires keeping out of status, the absence of which I know makes me vaguely unhappy. December 8, 1952. What is it that investment bankers do for their money? Well, I have certainly had my eyes opened as to the amount of toil, sweat, frustrations, problems. Yes, and tears. That has to be gone through. If everyone who has something to sell in the market had to be as meticulous and detailed in his statements about what he is selling as those who offer stock in the market are now, under the truth in securities law, darn little would be sold, in time to be useful, at least. December 20, 1952. My purpose in this Atapulgus venture is to make a good deal of money in a short time. In a way, old man capital gains. That enables me to keep 3/4 of it instead of paying 80 or more in income taxes. But there is another purpose. To have had the experience of business. The real reason, or the chief reason, is a feeling that my life wouldn't be complete living in a business period. That is, a time dominated by the business of business, unless I had been active in that area. What I wanted was to be an observer of this fascinating activity, that so colors and affects the world's life, not an observer from without, as a writer, teacher, but from the arena itself. I still have this feeling, and when I get low and glad to chuck the whole thing, as I have from time to time, the sustaining part is that even the bumps and sore spots are experiences, actual experiences within the business world. Then, too, you wanted to be able to make a comparison of the managers of business, the spirit, the tensions, the motivations, etc., with those of government. Something I keep doing anyway, and that needs doing to understand either government or business. This requires actual valid experience in the business world, somewhat comparable to my long hiring out in government matters. I don't kid myself that I will ever be accepted as a businessman. Not after those long years when I wore horns, for all of them outside the Tennessee Valley at least. And I feel less defensive, usually shown by a belligerence, on this score than I did when I rarely saw a tycoon or a Wall Streeter, whereas now I live with them. January 18, 1953. I am now definitely committed to minerals chemicals for not less than 3 more years, and morally committed to see the thing through. While I can't conceive that this business will ever seem enough, an end of itself to make up a satisfactory life, yet the busyness, the activity, the crises, the gambles, the management problems I must face, the judgment about people, all combine to make something far from dull. Add to this the good chance of making a good deal of money. My decision to try business. That seemed to so many people a bit of romantic moonshine. Makes more sense today than it did a year ago. But there is something missing. December 2, 1953. Crawford Greenwalt, president of DuPont, introduced me in a speech in Philadelphia. He noted that I had entered the chemical business, bearing in mind that I had previously headed the biggest things in America, bigger than I had previously headed the biggest things in America, bigger than private corporations. He was naturally a little nervous about seeing me become a potential competitor. It was kidding, but it was good kidding. It was good kidding, and it certainly gave little Ole Atapelgus quite a notice. June 30, 1954. I have found a new kind of satisfaction and, in a sense, fulfillment in a business career. I really never felt that the consultant thing was being a businessman or engaging in the realities of a life of business. Too remote from the actual thinking process, the exercise of judgment and decision. In this company, as we are evolving it, there are so many of the elements of fun. The starting with almost nothing. The company depending on patents alone. Acquisition, mergers, stock issues, proxy statements. The methods of financing internally and by bank loans. Also the way stock prices are made. The silly and almost childlike basis upon which grown men decide that a stock should be bought, and at what price of us. The merger with Edgar, the great subsequent rise in the price of their stock. The review of the price structure. The beginning of better costs. The catalyst idea. The drive and energy and imagination. The nights and days in the lab until 2 a.m., night after night, and finally the beginning of a new business. It is quite a story. Later, I got a rather different perspective on Lilienthal's reactions to the transition from government to business by talking to the man he had described as his business father confessor, Nathan Green. What happens to a man who leaves top-level government work and comes to Wall Street as a consultant? Green asked me rhetorically. Well, usually it's a big letdown. In the government, Dave was used to a sense of great authority and power, tremendous national and international responsibility. People wanted to be seen with him. Foreign dignitaries sought him out. He had all sorts of facilities, rows of buttons on his desk. He pushed them, and lawyers, technicians, accountants appeared to do his bidding. All right, now he comes to Wall Street. There's a big welcoming reception. He meets all the partners of his new firm and their wives. He's given a nice office with a carpet. But there's nothing on his desk, only one button, and all it summons is a secretary. He doesn't have perquisites like limousines. Furthermore, he really has no responsibility. He says to himself, I'm an idea man, I've got to have some ideas. He has some, but they're not given much attention by the partners. So the outward form of his new work is a letdown. The same with its content. In Washington, it had been development of natural resources, atomic energy, or the like. World-shaking things. Now it turns out to be some little business to make money. It all seems a bit petty. Then there's the matter of money itself. In the government, our hypothetical man didn't need it so badly. He had all these services and the basic comforts supplied him at no personal cost. And besides, he had a great sense of moral superiority. He was able to sneer at people who were out making money. He could think of somebody in his law school class who was making a pile in the street and say, He's sold out. Then our man leaves government and goes to the Wall Street fleshpots himself, and he says, boy, am I going to make these guys pay for my services. So they do pay too. He gets big fees for consulting. Then he finds out about big income taxes, how he has to pay most of his income to the government now instead of getting his livelihood from it. The shoe is on the other foot. He may, sometimes he does, begin to scream confiscation, just like any old Wall Streeter. How did Dave handle these problems? Well, he had his troubles. After all, he was starting a second sort of life, but he handled them just about as well as they can be handled. He was never bored, and he never screamed confiscation. He has a great capacity for sinking himself in something. The subject matter isn't so important to him. It's almost as if he were able to think that what he's doing is important, whether it is or not, simply because he's doing it. His ability was invaluable to Minerals Chemicals, and not just as an administrator. Dave is a lawyer after all. He knows more about corporate finances than he likes to admit. He enjoys playing the barefoot boy, but he's hardly that. Dave is an almost perfect example of somebody who kept his independence while getting rich on Wall Street. One way and another then, reading through these ambivalent protestations in the journal, and later hearing Green, I seem to detect under the exuberance and the absorption a nagging sense of dissatisfaction, almost of compromise. For Lilienthal, the obviously genuine thrill of having a new kind of experience, and an almost unimaginably profitable one, had been, I sensed, a rose with a worm in it. I went back up to the living room. There I found Lilithal Fayed on his back, on his back, on his back, on his back, on Shaw's rug underneath a pile of preschool-aged children. At least it looked at first glance like a pile. On closer inspection, I found that it consisted of just two boys. Mrs. Lilienthal, who had returned from the garden, introduced them as Alan and Daniel Bromberger, sons of the Lilienthal's daughter, Nancy and Sylvain Bromberger, adding that the Brombergers were living nearby since Sylvain was teaching philosophy at the university. A few weeks later, Bromberger moved on to the University of Chicago. The Lilienthal's only other offspring, David Jr., lived in Edgartown, Massachusetts, where he had settled down to become a writer, as he subsequently did. In response to the urging of the senior Lilienthals, the grandchildren climbed off their grandfather and disappeared from the room. When things were normal again, I told Lilienthal my reaction to the entries I had read in the journal, and he hesitated for a while before speaking. Yes, he said finally. Well, one thing. It wasn't making all that money that worried me. That didn't make me feel either good or bad by itself. In the government years, we always paid our bills, and by scrimping we've been able to save enough to send the kids to college. We'd never thought much about money. And then making a lot of it. Making $1 million. I was surprised, of course. I'd never especially aimed at that or thought it might happen to me. It's like when you're a boy and you try to jump 6 feet. Then you find you can jump 6 feet and you say, well, so what? It's sort of irrelevant. It's sort of irrelevant. Over the past few years, a lot of people have said to me, how does it feel to be rich? At first, I was kind of offended. There seemed to be an implied criticism in the question. But I'm over that. I tell them it doesn't feel any special way. The way I feel is, but this is going to sound stuffy. No, I don't think it's stuffy, said Mrs. Lilienthal, anticipating what was coming. Yes, it is, but I'm going to say it anyway, said Lilienthal. I don't think money makes much difference, as long as you have enough. I don't quite agree, said Mrs. Lilienthal. It doesn't make much difference when you're young. You don't mind then, as long as you can struggle along. But as you get older, it is helpful. Lilienthal nodded in deference to that. Then he said that he thought the undertone of dissatisfaction I had noticed in the journal probably stemmed, at least in part, from the fact that his career in private business, absorbing though it was, did not bring with it the gratifications of public service work. True, he had not been deprived of them entirely, because it was at the height of his Minerals Chemicals operations, in 1954, that he first went to Colombia, at the request of that country's government, and serving as a peso year consultant, started the Cavalli project that was later continued by the Developmental Resources Corporation. But for the most part, being a top officer of Minerals Chemicals had kept him pretty well tied down, and he'd had to regard the Colombia work as a sideline, if not merely a hobby. I found it impossible to avoid seeing symbolic significance in the fact that the principal material with which Lilienthal the businessman had been engaged was ley. I thought of something else in Lilienthal's life at that time that might have taken some of the kick out of the process of becoming a successful businessman. His big business book had come out when he was in the thick of the Minerals Chemicals work. I wondered whether, since it is such an uncritical paean to free enterprise, it had been construed by some people as a rationalization of his new career, and I asked about this. Well, the ideas in the book were rather a shock to some of my husband's New Deal friends. All right, Mrs. Lilienthal said a bit dryly. They needed shocking, damn it. Lilienthal burst out. He spoke with some heat, and I thought of the phrase in his journal, used there in an entirely different context, but still in reference to himself, about defensiveness shown by belligerents. After a moment, he went on in a normal tone. My wife and daughter thought I didn't spend enough time working on the book, and they were right. I wrote it in too much of a hurry. My conclusions aren't supported by enough argument. For one thing, I should have spelled out in more detail my opposition to the way the antitrust laws are administered. But the antitrust part wasn't the real trouble. The thing that really shook up some of my old friends was what I said about big industry in relation to individualism, and about the machine in relation to aesthetics. Morris Cook, who used to be administrator of the Rural Electrification Administration, he was one who was shaken up. He took me apart over the book, and I took him apart back. The anti-bigness dogmatists stopped having anything to do with me. They simply wrote me off. I wasn't hurt or disappointed. Those people are living on nostalgia. They look backward, and I try to look forward. Then, of course, there were the trust busters. They really went after me. But isn't trust busting, in the sense of breaking up big companies simply because they're big, pretty much a relic of a past era? Yes, I still think I was right in the main things. I said, perhaps ahead of my time, but right. The trouble was the timing, Mrs. Lilienthal said. The book came so close to coinciding with my husband's leaving public service and going into private business. Some people thought it represented a change in point of view induced by expediency, which it didn't. No, Lilienthal said. The book was written mostly in 1952, but all the ideas in it were hatched while I was still in public service. For example, my idea that bigness is essential for national security came in large part out of my experiences in the AEC, the company that had the research and manufacturing facilities to make the atomic bomb an operational weapon, so engineered that it wouldn't require EHDS to use it in the field. Bell Telephone, to be specific, was a big company. Because it was so big, the antitrust division of the Department of Justice was seeking to break the Bell system into several parts. Unsuccessfully, as it turned out, at the very time we in the A were calling on it to do a vital defense job that required unity. That seemed wrong. More generally, the whole point of view I expressed in the book goes way back to my quarrel with Arthur Morgan, the first TVFA chairman in the early 30s. He had great faith in a handicraft economy. I was for large-scale industry, TV. I, after all, was and is the biggest power system in the free world. In TVA, I always believed in bigness, along with decentralization. But, the chapter I hoped would produce the most discussion was the one on bigness as a promoter of individualism. It did produce discussion of a sort. I remember people, academic people mostly, coming up to me with incredulous expressions and saying something that started with, "Do you really believe?" Well, my answer would start with, yes, I really do believe. The process of making his Wall Street fortune was the fact that in making it, he had not really needed to scream confiscation, since he had made it through a tax loophole, the stock option. Possibly there have been liberal, reformist businessmen who have refused to accept stock options on principle, although I have never heard of one doing so, and I am not convinced that such a renunciation would be a sensible or useful form of protest. In any event, I didn't ask Lilienthal about the matter. In the absence of any accepted code of journalism, every journalist writes his own, and in mine, such a question would have come close to invasion of moral privacy. In retrospect, though, I almost wish I had violated my code that one time. Lilienthal, being Lilienthal, might have objected to the question strenuously, but I think he would have answered it equally strenuously, and without hedging. As things were, after discoursing on the critical reactions to his book, Big Business, he got up and walked to a window. "I see Dominic has been pretty cautious about his rose pruning," he said to his wife. "Maybe I'll go out later and cut them back some more." His jaw was set in a way that made me feel pretty sure I knew how the rose pruning controversy was going to be resolved. The triumphant solution to Lilienthal's problem, the way that he eventually found to have his cake and eat it, was the Development Resources Corporation. The corporation arose out of a series of conversations between Lilienthal and Mayer during the spring of 1955. in the course of which Lilienthal pointed out that he was well acquainted with dozens of foreign dignitaries and technical personnel who had come to visit the TVA, and said that their intense interest in that project seemed to indicate that at least some of their countries would be receptive to the idea of starting similar programs. Our aim in forming DIRR was not to try to remold the world or any large part of it, but only to try to help accomplish some rather specific things and, incidentally, make a profit, Lilienthal told me. Andre was not so sure about the profit. We both knew there would be a deficit at first, but he liked the idea of doing constructive things, and Lazard Frères decided to back us in return for a half interest in the corporation. Clapp, who was serving at the time as Deputy New York City Administrator, came in as co-founder of the venture, and the subsequent executive appointments made DEER virtually ATA Alumni Association. John Oliver, who became Executive Vice President, had been with TVA from 1942 to 1954, ending up as its general manager. WLULULULULU. Vordwin, who became Director of Engineering, had been with TVA for a decade and had planned its whole system of dams. Walton Seymour, who became Vice President for Industrial Development, had been a TVA consultant on electric power marketing for 13 years, and a dozen other former TVA men were scattered on down through the ranks. In July 1955, DRE set up shop at 44 Wall and set to work finding clients. What was to prove its most important one came to light during a World Bank meeting in Istanbul that Lilienthal and his wife attended in September of that year. At the meeting, Lilienthal fell in with Abul Hassan Ebtihaj, then head of a 7-year development plan in Iran. As it happened, Iran was just about the ideal client, since, for one thing, the royalties on its nationalized oil industry gave it considerable capital with which to pay for the development of its resources, and for another, what it desperately needed was technical and professional guidance. The encounter with Ebtihaj led to an invitation to Lilienthal and Clapp to visit Iran as the guests of the Shah and see what they thought could be done about Khuzestan. Lilienthal's employment contract with Minerals Chemicals ended that December. Although he stayed on as a director, he was now free to devote all his time, or nearly all of it, to in February 1956, he and Clapp went to Iran. Before then, I blush to say I had never heard of Khuzestan, Lilienthal told me. I've learned a lot about it since then. It was the heart of the Old Testament Elamite kingdom and later of the Persian Empire. The ruins of Persepolis are not far away, and those of Susa, where King Darius had his winter palace, are in the very center of Khuzestan. In ancient times, the whole region had an extensive water conservation system. You can still find the remains of canals that were probably built by Darius 2,500 years ago. But after the decline of the Persian Empire, the water system was ruined by invasion and neglect. Lord Curzon described what the Khuzestan uplands looked like a century ago, a desert over which the eye may roam unarrested for miles. It was that way when we got there. Nowadays, Khuzestan is one of the world's richest oil fields. The famous Abadan refinery is at its southern tip, but the inhabitants, 2.5 million of them, haven't benefited from that. The rivers have flowed unused. The fabulously rich soil has lain fallow, and all but a tiny fraction of the people have continued to live in desperate poverty. When Clapp and I first saw the place, we were appalled. Still, for two old TV hands like us, it was a dream. It was simply crying out for development. We looked for sites for dams, likely spots to hunt for minerals and make soil, fertility studies, and so on. We saw flares of natural gas rising from oil fields. That was waste, and it suggested petrochemical plants to use the gas for making fertilizer and plastics. In 8 days, we roughed out a plan, and in about 2 weeks, DR had signed a 5-year contract with the Iranian government. That was only the beginning. Bill Vordwin, our chief engineer, flew out there and spotted a wonderful dam site at a place just a few miles from the ruins of Susa, a narrow canyon with walls that rise almost vertically from the bed of the Des River. We found we were going to have to manage the project as well as advise on it, and so our next job was lining up our managerial group. To give you some idea of the size of the project, right now there are about 700 people working on it at the professional level, 100 Americans, 300 Iranians, and 300 Iranians, and 300 others, mostly Europeans who work directly for firms under subcontract. Besides that, There are about 4,700 Iranian laborers, over 5,000 people all told. The entire plan includes 14 dams on 5 different rivers and will take many years to finish. has just completed its first contract for 5 years and signed a new one for a year and a half with option to renew for another 5 years. Quite a bit has been accomplished already. Take the first dam, the Des 1. It's to be 620 feet high, or more than half again as high as the Aswan in Egypt, and it will eventually irrigate 360,000 acres and generate 520,000 kilowatts of electricity. It should be finished early in 1963. Meanwhile, a sugar plantation, the first in Khuzestan in 25 centuries, has been started with irrigation by pumped water. It should yield its first crop this summer, and a sugar refinery will be ready by the time the sugar is. Another thing, eventually the region will supply its own electric power from the dams. But for the interim period, a high-tension line, the first anywhere in Iran, has been put in over the 72 miles from Abadan to Hawazah, a city of 120,000 that previously had no power source except half a dozen little diesels, which seldom worked. While the Iranian project was proceeding, DER was also busy lining up and carrying out its programs for Italy, Colombia, Ghana, the Ivory Coast, and Puerto Rico, as well as programs for private business groups in Chile and the Philippines, a job that DEWR had just taken on for the United States Army Corps of Engineers excited Lilienthal enormously. An investigation of the economic impact of power from a proposed dam on the Alaskan sector of the Yukon, which he described as the river with the greatest hydroelectric potential remaining on this continent. Meanwhile, Lazard Freires retained its financial interest in the firm and now very happily collected its share of a substantial annual profit, and Lilienthal happily took to teasing Mayer about his former skepticism as to financial prospects. Lilienthal's new career had meant a highly peripatetic life, both for him and for Mrs. Lilienthal. He showed me his foreign travel log for 1960, which he said was a fairly typical year, and it read as follows. January 23, March 26, Honolulu, Tokyo, Manila, Iligan, Mindanao, Manila, Bangkok, Siem Reap, Bangkok, Chiang, Awaz, and Dimashq, Hawaz, Tehran. October 11-17, Buenos Aires, Patagonia, home. November 18, December 5, London, Tehran, Rome, Milan, Paris, home. Then he went and got the volume of his journal that relates to those trips. Turning to the pages on his stay in Iran early last spring, I was particularly struck by a few excerpts. Ahwaz! March 5, the cry of the Arab women as the Shah's big black Chrysler passed them, a solid row along the road from the airport, made me think of the rebel yell. Then I recognized it. It was the Indian yelp, the kind we used to make as kids, moving our hand over our mouths to give that undulating wail. Ahwaz, March 11, our experience in the villagers' huts on Wednesday threw me into a deep. I hovered between despair, which is an emotion I consider a sin, and anger, which doesn't do much good, I suppose. And Dimashq, March 9. We have traveled many miles through dust mud holes where we got stuck fast, and some of the roughest roads I have ever known. And we also traveled back to the 9th century and earlier, visiting villages and going into mud homes. Quite unbelievable and unforgettable forever and ever. As the biblical oath has it, let my right hand wither if I ever forget how some of the most attractive of my fellow human beings live, are living tonight only a few kilometers from here, where we visited them this afternoon. And yet I am as sure as I am writing these notes that the Gajebli area of only 45,000 acres swallowed in the vastness of the Khuzestan will become as well known as, say, the community of Tupelo became, or New Harmony or Salt Lake City when it was founded by a handful of dedicated men in a pass of the Great Rockies. The afternoon shadows were getting long on Battle Road, and it was time for me to be going. Lilienthal walked out to my car with me, and on the way I asked him whether he ever missed the rough and tumble in the limelight of being perhaps the most controversial man in Washington. He grinned and said, "Sure." When we reached the car, he went on, "I never intended to be especially combative, in Washington or in the Tennessee Valley. It was just that people kept disagreeing with me. But, all right, I wouldn't have put myself in controversial situations so much if I hadn't wanted to. I guess I was combative. When I was a kid, I was interested in boxing. At high school, In Michigan City, Indiana, I boxed a lot with a cousin of mine, and while I was in college at DePauw in central Indiana, I took to boxing during the summers with a man who had been a professional light heavyweight. The Tacoma Tiger, he'd been called. Working out with him was a challenge. If I made a mistake, I'd be on the floor. I wanted just once to land on him good. It was my ambition. I never did, of course, but I got to be a fairly good boxer. I became boxing coach at DePauw while I was an undergraduate. Later on, at Harvard Law, I didn't have time to keep it up, and I never boxed seriously again. But I don't think that for me, boxing was an expression of combativeness for its own sake. I think I considered competence at defending yourself a means of preserving your personal independence. I learned that from my father. Be your own man, he used to say. He'd come from Austria-Hungary, the part that's now Eastern Czechoslovakia, in the 1880s when he was about 20, and he spent his adult life as a storekeeper in various Middle Western towns. Morton, Illinois, where I was born. Valparaiso, Indiana, Springfield, Missouri, Michigan City, and later Winnemac, Indiana. He had very pale blue eyes that reflected the insides of him. You could tell by looking at him that he wouldn't trade independence for security. He didn't know how to dissemble and wouldn't have wanted to if he had known how. Well, to get back to my being controversial or combative, or whatever you call it, in Washington. Yes, there's something missing when you don't have a McKellar laying it on the line anymore. The moral equivalent of that for me now is taking on challenges. Different kinds of McKellars or Tacoma Tigers, maybe. The minerals, chemicals thing, the DA short thing, and trying to meet them. I revisited Lilienthal in early summer, 1968. This time at DER's third home office, a suite with a splendid harbor view at I-Whitehall Street. Both White R and he had moved along in the interim. In Kazakhstan, the Diesel Dam had been completed on schedule. Water impounding had begun in November 1962. The first power had been delivered in May 1963, and the region was now not only supplying its own power, but producing enough surplus to attract foreign industry. Meanwhile, agriculture in the once barren region was flourishing as a result of irrigation made possible by the dam. And as Lilienthal, 68 now and as combative as ever. Would it, the gloomy economists, have to be gloomy about some other underdeveloped country? DER had just signed a new 5-year contract with Iran to carry on the work. Otherwise, the firm had expanded its clientele to include 14 countries. Its most controversial undertaking was in Vietnam, where, under contract with the United States government, it was cooperating with a similar group of South Vietnamese and working up plans for the post-war development of the Mekong Valley. This assignment had led to criticism of Lilienthal by those who took it to imply that he supported the war. In fact, he told me he regarded the war as the disastrous outcome of a series of horrible miscalculations, and the planning of post-war resources development as a separate matter. It was clear enough, nevertheless, that the criticism hurt. At the same time, DER was widening its horizons by beginning to move, unexpectedly, into domestic urban development, having been engaged by private foundation-sponsored groups in Queens County, New York, and Oakland County, Michigan, to see whether the TVA approach might have some value in dealing with those modern deserts, the slums. Just pretend this is Zambia and tell us what you would do, these groups had said, in effect, to DER, a wildly imaginative idea, surely the usefulness of which remained to be proved. As for DER itself and its place in American business, Lilienthal recounted that since I had seen him, it had expanded to the extent of opening a second permanent office on the West Coast, had considerably increased its profits, and become essentially employee-owned, with Lazard retaining only a token interest. Most encouraging of all, at a time when old line business was having serious recruitment problems because its obsession with profit was repelling high-minded youth, DER found that its idealistic objectives made it a magnet for the most promising new graduates. And as a result of all these things, Lilienthal could at last say what he had not been able to say on the earlier occasion. That private enterprise was now affording him more satisfaction than he had ever derived from public service. Is EDR, then, a prototype of the free enterprise of the future, accountable half to its stockholders and half to the rest of humanity? If so, then the irony is complete, and Lilienthal, of all people, ends up as the prototypical businessman. Chapter 10. Stockholder Season. A few years ago, a European diplomat was quoted in the Times as saying, "The American economy has become so big that it is beyond the imagination to comprehend. But now, on top of size, you're getting rapid growth as well." It is a situation of fundamental power unequaled in the history of the world. At about the same time, Burley wrote in A Study of Corporate Power that the 500 or so corporations that dominate that economy represent a concentration of power over economics which makes the medieval feudal system look like a Sunday school party. As for the power within those corporations, it clearly rests, for all practical purposes, with their directors and their professional managers, often not substantial owners, who, Burl goes on to suggest in the same essay, sometimes constitute self-perpetuating oligarchy. Most fair-minded observers these days seem to feel that the stewardship of the oligarchs, from a social point of view, isn't anything like as bad as it might be, and in many cases is pretty good. Yet, however that may be, the ultimate power theoretically does not reside in them at all. According to the corporate form of organization, it resides in the stockholders, of whom, in United States business enterprises of all sizes and descriptions, there are more than 20 million. Even though the courts have repeatedly ruled that a director does not have to follow stockholder instructions, any more than a congressman has to follow the instructions of his constituents, stockholders nevertheless do elect directors on the logical, if not exactly democratic, basis of one share, one vote. The stockholders are deprived of their real power by a number of factors, among which are their indifference to it in times of rising profits and dividends, their ignorance of corporate affairs, and their sheer numbers. One way or another, they vote the management slate, and the results of most director elections have a certain Russian ring. 99% or more of the votes cast in favor. The chief, and in many cases the only, occasion when stockholders make their presence felt by management is at the annual meeting. Company annual meetings are customarily held in the spring, and one spring, it was that of 1966. I made the rounds of a few of them to get a line on what the theoretical holders of all that feudal power had to say for themselves, and also on the state of their relations with their elected directors. What particularly commended the 1966 season to me was that it promised to be a particularly lively one. Various reports of a new hardline approach by company managements to stockholders had appeared in the press. I was charmed by the notion of a candidate for office announcing his new hardline approach to voters right before an election. The new approach, it was reported, was the upshot of events at the previous year's meetings, where a new high-end stockholder unruliness was reached. The chairman of the Communications Satellite Corporation was forced to call on guards to eject bodily two badgering stockholders at his company's meeting in Washington. Harlan C. Forbes, who was then the chairman of Consolidated Edison, ordered one heckler off the premises in New York, and in Philadelphia, American Telephone Telegraph chairman Frederick R.A. Capel was goaded into announcing abruptly, "This meeting is not being run by Robert's Rules of Orders. It's being run by me." The executive director of the American Society of Corporate Secretaries later explained that precise application of Robert's rules would have had the effect not of increasing the stockholders' freedom of speech, but rather of restricting it. Mr. Capel, the secretary implied, had merely been protecting stockholders from parliamentary tyranny. In Schenectady, Gerald L. Philippe, chairman of General Electric, after several hours of fencing with stockholders, summed up his new hardline by saying, "I should like it to be clear that next year, and in the years to come, the chair may well adopt a more rigorous attitude." According to Businessweek, the General Electric management then assigned a special task force to the job of seeing what could be done about cracking down on hecklers by changing the annual meeting pattern, and early in 1966, the Bible of Management, the Harvard Business Review, entered the list. With an article by O. Glenn Saxon, Jr., the head of a company specializing in investor services to management, in which he recommended crisply that the chairman of annual meetings recognize the authority inherent in the role of the chair and resolve to use it appropriately. Apparently, the theoretical holders of fundamental power unequaled in the history of the world were about to be put in their place. One thing I couldn't help noticing as I went over the schedule of the year's leading meetings was a trend away from holding them in or near New York. Invariably, the official reason given was that the move would accommodate stockholders from other areas who had seldom, if ever, been able to attend in the past. However, most of the noisiest dissident stockholders seemed to be based in the New York area, and the moves were taking place in the year of the new hardline. so I found the likelihood of a relationship between these two facts by no means remote. United States Steel holders, for example, were to meet in Cleveland, making their second foray outside their company's nominal home state of New Jersey since its formation in 1901. General Electric was going outside New York State for the third time in recent years, and going all the way to Georgia, a state in which management appeared to have suddenly discovered 5,600 stockholders, or a bit more than 1% of the firm's total roll, who were badly in need of a chance to attend an annual meeting. The biggest company of them all, American Telephone Telegraph, had chosen Detroit, which was its third site outside New York City in its 81-year history, the second having been Philadelphia, where the 1965 session was held. To open my own meeting, going season, I tracked ATT to Detroit. Leafing through some papers on the plane going out there, I learned that the number of AET stockholders had increased to an all-time record of almost 3 million, and I fell to wondering what would happen in the unlikely event that all of them, or even half of them, appeared in Detroit and demanded seats at the meeting. At any rate, each one of them had received by mail a few weeks earlier a notice of the meeting along with a formal invitation to attend, and it seemed to me almost certain that American industry had achieved another first, the first time almost 3 million individual invitations had ever been mailed out to any event of any kind anywhere. My fears on the first score were put to rest when I got to Cobo Hall, a huge riverfront auditorium where the meeting was to take place. The hall was far from filled. The Yankees in their better days would have been disgusted with such a turnout on any weekday afternoon. The papers next day said the attendance was 4,016. Looking around, I noticed in the crowd several families with small children, one woman in a wheelchair, one man with a beard, and just 2 Negro stockholders. The last observation suggesting that the trumpeters of people's capitalism might well do some coordinating with the civil rights movement. The announced time of the meeting was 1:30, and Chairman Capel entered on the dot and marched to a reading stand on the platform. The 18 other ATD directors trooped to a row of seats just behind him, and Mr. Capel gavelled the meeting to order. From my reading and from annual meetings that I'd attended in past years, I knew that the meetings of the biggest companies are usually marked by the presence of so-called professional stockholders, persons who make a full-time occupation of buying stock in companies or obtaining the proxies of other stockholders, then informing themselves more or less intimately about the corporation's affairs and attending annual meetings to raise questions or propose resolutions. And that the most celebrated members of this breed were Mrs. Wilma Sauce of New York, who heads an organization of women stockholders and votes the proxies of its members as well as her own shares, and Louis D. Gilbert, also of New York, who represents his own holdings and those of his family, a considerable total. Something I did not know and learned at the ATT meeting and at others I attended subsequently was that, apart from the prepared speeches of management, a good many big company meetings really consist of a dialogue. In some cases, it's more of a duel between the chairman and the few professional stockholders. The contributions of non-professionals run strongly to ill-informed or tame questions and windy encomiums of management, and thus the task of making cogent criticisms or asking embarrassing questions falls to the professionals. Though largely self-appointed, they become, by default, the sole representatives of a huge constituency that may badly need representing. Some of them are not very good representatives, and a few are so bad that their conduct raises a problem in American manners. These few repeatedly say things at annual meetings, boorish, silly, insulting, or abusive things that are apparently permissible by corporate rules but are certainly impermissible by drawing room rules, and sometimes succeed in giving the annual meetings of mighty companies the general air of barnyard squabbles. Mrs. Sauce, a former public relations woman who has been a tireless professional stockholder since 1947, is usually a good many cuts above this level. True, she is not beyond playing to the gallery by wearing bizarre costumes to meetings. She tries with occasional success to taunt recalcitrant chairmen into throwing her out. She is often scolding and occasionally abusive, and nobody could accuse her of being unduly concise. I confess that her customary tone and manner set my teeth on edge, but I can't help recognizing that because she does her homework. She usually has a point. Mr. Gilbert, who has been at it since 1933 and is the dean of them all, almost invariably has a point, and by comparison with his colleagues, he is the soul of brevity and punctilio. as well as of dedication and diligence. Despised as professional stockholders are by most company managements, Mrs. Sauce and Mr. Gilbert are widely enough recognized to be listed in Who's Who in America. Furthermore, for what satisfaction it may bring them, they're the nameless Agamemnons and Ajaxes invariably called individuals in some of the prose epics produced by the business establishment itself. The greater portion of the discussion period was taken up by questions and statements of a few individuals on matters that can scarcely be deemed relevant. Two individuals interrupted the opening statement of the chairman. The chairman advised the individuals who had interrupted to choose between ceasing their interruption or leaving the meeting. So reads, in part, the official report of the 1965 ATS annual meeting. And although Mr. Saxon's piece in the Harvard Business Review was entirely about professional stockholders and how to deal with them, the author's corporate dignity did not permit him to mention the name of even one of them. Avoiding this was quite a trick, but Mr. Saxon pulled it off. Both Mrs. Sauce and Mr. Gilbert were present at Cobo Hall. Indeed, the meeting had barely got underway before Mr. Gilbert was on his feet, complaining that several resolutions he had asked the company to include in the proxy statement and the meeting agenda had been omitted from both. Mr. Capel, a stern-looking man with steel-rimmed spectacles who was unmistakably cast in the old-fashioned, aloof corporate mold rather than the new, more permissive one, replied shortly that the Gilbert proposals had referred to matters that were not proper for stockholder consideration, and it had been submitted too late anyhow. Mr. Capel then announced that he was about to report on company operations, whereupon the 18 other directors filed off the platform. Evidently, they had been there only to be introduced, not to field questions from stockholders. Exactly where they went, I don't know. They vanished from my field of vision, and I wasn't enlightened when, later on in the meeting, Mr. Capel responded to a stockholder's question as to their whereabouts with a laconic statement, "They're here." "Going it alone," Mr. Capel said in his report that business is booming. Earnings are good and the prospect ahead is for more of the same, declared that AT&T ship was eager for the Federal Communications Commission to get on with its investigation of telephone rates, since the company had no skeletons in the closet, and then painted a picture of a bright telephonic future in which picture phones will be commonplace and light beams will carry messages. When Mr. Capel's address was over and the management-sponsored slate of directors for the coming year had been duly nominated, Mrs. Sauce rose to make a nomination of her own. Dr. Frances Arkin, a psychoanalyst. In explanation, Mrs. Sauce said that she felt AT&T ought to have a woman on its board, and that, furthermore, she sometimes felt some of the company's executives would be benefited by occasional psychiatric examinations. This remark seemed to me gratuitous, but the balance of manners between bosses and stockholders was subsequently redressed, at least to my mind, at another meeting when the chairman suggested that some of his firm's stockholders ought to see a psychiatrist. The nomination of Dr. Arkin was seconded by Mr. Gilbert, although not until Mrs. Sauce, who was sitting a couple of seats from him, had reached over and nudged him vigorously in the ribs. Presently, a professional stockholder named Evelyn I. Davis protested the venue of the meeting, complaining that she had been forced to come all the way from New York by bus. Mrs. Davis, a brunette, was the youngest and perhaps the best-looking of the professional stockholders, but on the basis of what I saw at the AET meeting and others, not the best informed or the most temperate, serious-minded, or worldly wise. On this occasion, she was greeted by thunderous boos, and when Mr. Capel answered her by saying, "You're out of order. You're just talking to the wind," he was loudly cheered. It was only then that I understood the nature of the advantage that the company had gained by moving its meeting away from New York. It had not succeeded in shaking off the gadflies, but it had succeeded in putting them in a climate where they were subject to the rigors of that great American emotion, regional pride. A lady in a flowered hat who said she was from Des Plaines, Illinois, emphasized the point by rising to say, "I wish some of the people here would behave like intelligent adults rather than 2 years." Prolonged applause. Even so, the sniping from the east went on, and by 3:30, when the meeting had been in session for 2 hours, Mr. Capel was clearly getting testy. He began pacing impatiently around the platform, and his answers got shorter and shorter. "Okay, okay," was all he replied to one complaint that he was dictatorial. The climax came in a wrangle between him and Mrs. Sauce about the fact that ETE, although it had listed the business affiliations of its nominees for director in a pamphlet that was handed out at the meeting, had failed to list them in the material mailed out to the stockholders, the overwhelming majority of whom were not at the meeting and had done their voting by proxy. Most other big companies make such disclosures in their mailed proxy statements, so the stockholders were apparently entitled to a reasonable explanation of why AU Schist had failed to do so, but somewhere along the way, reason was left behind. As the exchange progressed, Mrs. Sos adopted a scolding tone and Mr. Capel an icy one. As for the crowd, it was having a fine time booing the Christian, if that is what Mrs. Sauce represented, and cheering the lion, if that is what Mr. Capel represented. "I can't hear you, sir," Mrs. Sauce said at one point. "Well, if you just listen instead of talking," Mr. Capel returned. Then Mrs. Sauce said something I didn't catch, and it must have been a telling bit of chairman baiting, because Mr. Capel's manner changed completely, from ice to fire. He began shaking his finger and saying he wouldn't stand for any more abuse, and the floor microphone that Mrs. Sauce had been using was abruptly turned off, followed at a distance of 10 or 15 feet by a uniformed security guard, and to the accompaniment of deafening booing and stamping, Mrs. Sauce marched up the aisle and took a stand in front of the platform, facing Mr. Capel, who informed her that he knew she wanted him to have her thrown out and that he declined to comply. Eventually, Mrs. Sauce went back to her seat and everybody calmed down. The rest of the meeting, given over largely to questions and comments from amateur stockholders rather than professional ones, was certainly less lively than what had gone before, and not noticeably higher in intellectual content. Stockholders from Grand Rapids, Detroit, and Ann Arbor all expressed the view that it would be best to let the directors run the company, although the Grand Rapids man objected mildly that the Bell telephone hour couldn't be received on television in his locality anymore. A man from Pleasant Ridge, Michigan, spoke up for retired stockholders who would like AAT to plow less of its earnings back into expansion so that it could pay higher dividend. A stockholder from rural Louisiana stated that when he picked up his telephone lately, the operator didn't answer for 5 or 10 minutes. "Bring it to your attention," the Louisiana man said, and Mr. Capel promised to have somebody look into the matter. Mrs. Davis raised a complaint about his contributions to charity, giving Mr. Capel the opportunity to reply that he was glad the world contained people more charitable than she. Tex. Exempt applause. A Detroit man said, "I hope you won't let the abuse you've been subjected to by a few malcontents keep you from bringing the meeting back to the great Midwest again." It was announced that Dr. Arkin had been defeated for a seat on the board since she had received a vote of only 19,106 shares against some 400 million proxy votes included for each candidate on the management slate. By approving the management slate, a proxy voter can, in effect, oppose a floor nomination, even though he knows nothing about it. And that was how the 1966 annual meeting of the world's largest company went, or how it went until 5:30, when all but a few hundred stockholders had left, and all but a few hundred stockholders had left when I headed for the airport to catch a plane back to New York. The ATT meeting left me in a thoughtful mood. Annual meetings, I reflected, can be times to try the soul of an admirer of representative democratic government, especially when he finds himself guiltily sympathizing with the chairman who is being badgered from the floor. The professional stockholders, in their wilder moments, are management's secret weapon. A Mrs. Sauce and a Mrs. Davis at their most strident could have made Commodore Vanderbilt and Pierpont Morgan seem like affable old gentlemen, and they can make a latter-day magnate like Mr. Capel seem like a henpecked husband, if not actually a champion of stockholders' rights. At such moments, the professional stockholders become, from a practical standpoint, enemies of intelligent dissent. On the other hand, I thought, they deserve sympathy too, whether or not one believes they have right on their side, because they are in the position of representing a constituency that doesn't want to be represented. It's hard to imagine anyone more reluctant to claim his democratic rights, or more suspicious of anyone who tries to claim them for him than a dividend. Fattened stockholder, and of course most stockholders are thoroughly dividend. Fattened these days. Burrell speaks of the estate of stockholding as being by its nature passive, receptive, rather than managing and creating. Most of the AT&T stockholders in Detroit, it seemed to me, were so deeply devoted to the notion of the company as Santa Claus that they went beyond passive receptivity to active cupboard love. And the professional stockholders, I felt, had taken on an assignment almost as thankless as that of recruiting for the Young Communist League among the junior executives of the Chase Manhattan Bank. In view of Chairman Philippe's warning to General Electric stockholders at Schenectady in 1965, and of the report about the company's hardline task force, it was with a sense of being engaged in hot pursuit that I boarded a southbound Pullman for the General Electric annual meeting. This one was held in Atlanta's Municipal Auditorium, a snappy hall, the rear of which was brightened by an interior garden complete with trees and a lawn. And in spite of the fact that it was held on a languorous, rainy southern spring morning, more than 1,000 stockholders turned out. As far as I could see, 3 of them were Negroes, and it was not long before I saw that another of them was Mrs. Sauce. However, exasperated he may have become the previous year in Schenectady, Mr. Felipe, who also conducted the 1966 meeting, was in perfect control of himself and of the situation this time around. Whether he was expatiating on the wonders of GE's balance sheet and its laboratory discoveries or sparring with the professional stockholders, he spoke in the same sing-song way, delicately treading the thin line between patient, careful exposition and irony. Mr. Saxon, in his Harvard Business Review article, had written, "Top executives are finding it necessary to learn how to lessen the adverse impact of the few disruptors on the majority of share owners, while simultaneously enhancing the positive effects of the good things which do take place in the annual meeting." And having learned sometime earlier that the same Mr. Saxon had been engaged by GEE as an advisor on stockholder relations, I couldn't help suspecting that Mr. Phillips' performance was a demonstration of Saxonism in action. The professional stockholders, for their part, responded by adopting precisely the same ambiguous style, and the resulting dialogue had the general air of a conversation between 2 people who have quarreled and then decided, not quite wholeheartedly, to make it up. The professional stockholders might have demanded to know how much money GEA had spent in the interest of keeping them under control, but they missed the chance. One of the exchanges in this vein achieved a touch of wit. Mrs. So, speaking in her sweetest tone, called attention to the fact that one of the board of directors candidates, Frederick L. Hovden, president of Purdue University and former chairman of the Army Scientific Advisory Panel, owned only 10 shares of GE stock and said she felt that the board should be made up of more substantial holders, whereupon Mr. Philippe pointed out just as sweetly that the company had many thousands of holders of 10 or fewer shares, Mrs. So's among them, and suggested that perhaps these small holders were deserving of representation on the board by one of their number. Mrs. Sauce had to concede a fine stroke of chairmanship, and she did. On another matter, although decorum was stringently maintained by both sides, outward accord was less complete. Several stockholders, Mrs. So's among them, had formally proposed that the company adopt for its director elections the system called cumulative voting, under which a stockholder may concentrate all the votes he is entitled to on a single candidate rather than spread them over the whole slate, and which therefore gives a minority group of stockholders a much better chance of electing one representative to the board. Cumulative voting, though a subject of controversy in big business circles for obvious reasons, is nevertheless a perfectly respectable idea. Indeed, it is mandatory for companies incorporated in more than 20 states, and it is used by some 400 companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Nevertheless, Mr. Philippe did not find it necessary to answer Mrs. Sauce's argument for cumulative voting. He chose instead to stand on a brief company statement on the subject that had been previously mailed out to stockholders, the main point of which was that the presence on the GE board, as a result of cumulative voting, of representatives of special interest groups might have a divisive and disruptive effect. Of course, Mr. Philippe did not say he knew, as he doubtless did know, that the company had in hand more than enough proxies to defeat the proposal. Some companies, like some animals, have their private, highly specialized gadflies who harass them and nobody else, and General Electric is one. In this instance, the gadfly was Louis A. Brusotti of Chicago, who at the company's meetings over the past 13 years had advanced 31 proposals, all of which had been defeated by a vote of at least 97% to 3%. In Atlanta, Mr. Brusotti, a gray-haired man built like a football player, was at it again, not with proposals this time, but with questions. For one thing, he wanted to know why Mr. Philippe's personal holdings of GE stock, listed in the proxy statement, now were 423 shares fewer than they had been a year ago. Mr. Philippe replied that the difference represented shares that he had contributed to family trust funds and added mildly but with emphasis, "I could say it's none of your business." I believe I have a right to the privacy of my affairs. There was more reason for the mildness than for the emphasis, as Mr. Brusati did not fail to point out, in an impeccably unemotional monotone. Many of Mr. Phillips' shares had been acquired under options at preferential prices not available to others, and, moreover, the fact that Mr. Phillips' precise holdings had been included in the proxy statement clearly showed that in the opinion of the Securities and Exchange Commission, his holdings were Mr. Brusati's business. Going on to the matter of the fees paid directors, Mr. Brusati elicited from Mr. Filippi the information that over the past 7 years, these had been raised from $2,500 per annum first to $5,000, and then to $7,500. The ensuing dialogue between the two men went like this. By the way, who establishes those fees? Those fees are established by the board of directors. The board of directors establish their own fees. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Brusati. Later on in the morning, there were several lengthy and eloquent orations by stockholders on the virtues of General Electric and of the South. But this rather elegantly elliptical exchange between Mr. Brusati and Mr. Filippi stuck in my mind, for it seemed to sum up the spirit of the meeting. Only after adjournment, which came at 12:30 following Mr. Filippi's announcement that the unopposed slate of directors had been elected and that cumulative voting had lost by 97.51% to 2.49%. Indeed, I realized that not only had there been no stamping, booing, or shouting, as there had been in Detroit, but regional pride had not had to be invoked against the professional stockholders. It had been General Electric's whole card, I felt, but General Electric had won on the board without needing to turn it up. Each meeting I attended had its easily discernible characteristic tone, and that of Chase. Pfizer Company, the diversified pharmaceutical and chemical firm, was amicability. Pfizer, which in previous years had customarily held its annual meeting at its headquarters in Brooklyn, reversed the trend by moving this year's meeting right into the lair of the most vocal dissenters, Midtown Manhattan. But everything that I saw and heard convinced me that the motivation behind this move had been not a brash resolve on the company's part to beard the lions in their den, but a highly unfashionable desire to get the maximum possible turnout. Pfizer seemed to feel self-confident enough to meet its stockholders with its guard down. For instance, in contrast with the other meetings I attended, no stockholder tickets were collected or credentials checked at the